and I'm going to invite our speakers for the panel, the closing panel for today, where we're going to go together, we're going to go through most of the conclusions and points that were talked about this afternoon, and you'll also have the opportunity to ask questions, of course. So I'd like to welcome Juliette Mauro, who is the president of Femtech in France, Anna-Liisa, who is advisor at the Ministry for Justice in Estonia, and Emer, Cahill, who is Programs and Communications Manager at the Centre of Excellence for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Higher Education Authority in Ireland. Good evening to all three of you this time, and welcome. And it's a pleasure to have you with us, because you're going to bring a different perspective to what has been discussed earlier today. I mean, you're not researchers as such, so you've been listening to the testimonies and the results that we have heard about, and I'm sure that you've already got some ideas or some comments. And maybe I'd like to start with that, to sort of just a few comments that come to your mind. What are your first reactions to all the research projects that we have heard about this afternoon? Emer, would you like to start?
I shouldn't have taken the mic.
Well, I would have gone the other side. So
that's okay. Just to say, actually, I'm with the Irish Research Council. That Suzanne Walker, who was supposed to be with us today, is from the Centre of Excellence, but unfortunately she wasn't able to travel. So I'm going to do my best to stand in for her. But anyway, I think. Honestly, today we were only talking about it with a colleague of mine. It's really wonderful for us, certainly from a funding perspective, to be able to come and listen to all the outputs from the 13 projects, because it's so rare for us to actually see this side of it. You know, we look at the applications and we look at the projects as they come in, but to actually be able to see the outputs is really, it's brilliant, it's fascinating, and it's really resonating with, I think, a lot of the work that we try to do internally in terms of policy and even the work that goes on in the Centre of Excellence. There's so many overlaps with the work that you've been talking about, even just thinking about Susan mentioning the advisory groups or their sounding board. It's a similar process when we're looking at policy. It's about engaging with advocacy groups, engaging with multiple levels of policy, and really bringing all these actors together and sharing that voice, and making sure that you're again, as it came up with one of the other projects, giving the voice to the victims. So when you're talking about gender-based violence and you're talking about, we have policies on bullying and harassment, it's about giving that voice back to the people, to the survivors, I suppose, as you would call it, and making sure that they are represented in the policies that you're putting together, and making sure that it's fit for purpose from their perspective, having been through this traumatic ordeal. So yeah, there's so much overlap that I've heard today from the work that's been going on, and I think that one of the big things that I would take away from this conference is that we need more of this. We need more to know and to make those links between the amazing research that's going on and the policies that are coming out of it and the recommendations, and making sure they're landing in the right places. Because I think on the other side of it, we would hear about policymakers who are crying out for evidence-based information. They want to be able to make sound decisions based on evidence, but for some reason that connect is missing, where you would have people looking for the evidence and then people making the evidence and saying, well, where can I put it? And I think that is the missing bridge in and it's just very evident today that we need to be getting this information into the right hands, and how to go about that. And I don't have that answer, so I'm sorry, but But yeah, no, it's been really great.
Yeah, at least oops, sorry. It's also been a long day for me. The bridges have been built and they now exist, and listening to one another has certainly proved very useful. Anna-Liisa, indeed, the same question. How can we better take into account the findings of all the research projects that we've been hearing about today, and how can we implement them in policy design and policy implementation? How can we make how can we build those bridges further?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for having me here today. And I think the first thing is that I agree with you that we should have more of these discussions where we have researchers and policymakers together. And I would like to see more events where I'm not basically the only policymaker on the ministry level, but there would be half and half maybe, or something like that. And one thought that came to my head, I was thinking about all these topics today. I have so much to still take in and to think about, and there are so many parallels running in my head with different topics that we deal in Estonia on a ministerial level. And one thing that I was thinking about is how do researchers pick these topics? Where do they come to them? Why these topics? And how can they be beneficial for policymakers? Because we very often we seek for data, we seek for evidence, how and why to do things, but at the same time, often we have, how to say, urgent matters, and we always don't have the data on things that need to be done. We don't have research on these things, so. Can researchers be more, what would be the right word? Sorry, I can't get the right word, but act faster on the demand from the policy level and from the ministries. I think this would also help to work more together and also to implement the findings in real life policies.
Thank you. Maybe I'll come back to Elisabeth with that particular question about more coordination and about more relations. But I'll continue with the same question to Juliette first. So, Juliette, maybe first you can tell us what Femtech is about, because I'm sure that there are many people in the room who don't necessarily know. And then same question, how can we how can we integrate better and further the outcome of research, such as we've heard today, into policy?
Okay, thanks for inviting me. I'm the entrepreneur in the room, so I think I'm the only one, correct? So I'm not a policy maker, not a searcher. What's Femtech? Femtech is a terminology that regroups all the companies that are working on women's health innovation. So it's a terminology that has been created by Ida Tin, who's the founder of Clue. Maybe some of you have or are using this app. It's an app to follow your menstruation, and it regroups all the innovation that relate. So it can either be a software, it can be a product, it can be a service that relates to women's health. And the particularity of Femtech is that most of the companies have been created by women, and more specifically by women who had a need that was not fulfilled, and that thought that maybe they could bring that solution. So that being said, and as a matter of fact, I'm an entrepreneur in Femtech myself, and with a few colleagues, we have created an NGO that gathers other entrepreneurs in France, but there are other people like me in a lot of countries right now, and we are trying to build and convince politics as well of the necessity to help on research and funding in general in women's health. That being said, thanks a lot for the communication this afternoon. My first reaction was. It's super interesting because, and probably it relates to intersectionality, although I'm not a searcher, so I'm not very familiar with that word. But we tend, as an entrepreneur, to look at one part of the woman that we are trying to help, and with a lot of cliché. most of the time. So it was quite interesting to open my mind on some of the subjects you approach, such as ageism, vulnerability, obviously. I'm sorry to come back on FGM because but as a matter of fact, actually for my own company, I was thinking, oh, it's true that today when we talk about FGM, we tend to put it on a victimized side, and it's on the violence category. And actually, I was thinking that it does not make my app user-friendly for women that are just looking for information for their own menopause or just pleasure, which is the type of things that I'm discussing on my app. So that's the interesting thing, and thank you for that.
Thank you. Elisabeth, I don't want to put you in the spotlight, but I was wondering maybe if you had just a quick answer to the point made by Anna-Liisa about the choice of topics. How are topics chosen for research?
Well, I think the main issue you addressed, Anna-Liisa, is, well, definitely science should help decision-making, political decision-making. But there is a difference between really science and expertise. I think scientists can provide a lot of expertise, but they have also their own logic in their projects and interests, and they like to develop methods. You see there were a lot of discussions and the workshop in Paris also on scientific methods, because it's to improve science and expertise you can provide, sometimes on demand, for ministries and others. But it's definitely a very important issue, because there is so much good science everywhere, and it's not really used. I mean, if you think also of all the environmental issues, a lot of science is really needed, because it's so complicated. And the link between policymakers and scientists is a tricky issue. It should be improved. Probably scientists should also, yes, be able to provide some expertise on demand, but it's not exactly the same. So there is an own way of thinking in science, but part of maybe the research, when the outputs, once you have really worked on the scientific problem, it's more on how do we disseminate all these results. And that's really the purpose of this conference, but we all know it's not enough disseminated. It's in the dissemination process, and once the projects have their results, and then maybe we could think also on developing expertise on demand with scientists who are ready to do it. So, but I think the researchers involved in the project should really answer.
Birgitta, your point of view.
Thank you. I think this is very important what you are raising the questions. I just have one comment. It's also a problem, not a problem, but a fact that politicians are politicians. They have their ideology. That is politics, right? And so then the question, there is a rhetorical question, what comes first? The ideology, and then you want some research that confirms that. Or if we have an open-ended question, as we do as a researcher, and we come with the results, and that is used and implemented despite or independent the ideology. So that is, and then there is another thing that we have a huge research project where we have a basic question where we see policy there is a paradox in the Swedish policy. We have a strong gender equality policy since the 70s, but also since the 70s we have a strong diversity, that a multi-ethnic society, and that implies sometimes a clash, that the gender equality doesn't fit into the diversity values. So that's another thing.
Yes, sure. And Anna-Liisa, you have a point, and then we have two questions. We have a question at the very back and a question from the lady there. Yes.
I just wanted to reflect that I didn't mean to question the aim of research or anything. I'm just trying to say that maybe we need to find more ways to not go on parallel roads, but to find points to meet. And it's also true about politicians, that we sometimes have to make a difference between policymakers in the ministries and ministerial level and politicians, because usually people who work in ministries, they also are experts in their field, and they base on science and what the science says. But politicians, maybe true, not so often. They tend to run on belief rather than on science.
Right, we have a question at the very back, to the right.
Hello. I feel like I have to talk about the policy funder part, being the largest public funder of research and innovation in the UK, based at UKRI. My suggestion is a mixed model, as opposed to it has to be one thing or another. We should be funding brilliant ideas wherever they come from, and brilliant innovations. But we also want to, at least within the UK's context, use our public money well, and actually demonstrate the impact of that for the people who live there, and actually think even bigger and think about the larger global challenges. So that means interfacing quite carefully with ministries or agencies, federal agencies or departments, is actually a benefit for us. And I'll give you two examples of things that UKRI has funded in the last kind of 4 and 5 years that is a direction of travel. So within the UK context, most of you will know that many of our government departments have chief science advisors that sit within them. Well, they are magnificent to spend time with and actually talk to them, not only about the capacity that's in their department, back to the people who actually have qualifications in the department, but what do they want to do hand in hand perhaps with other agencies or in other groups that they don't actually have those links with. That's in government, but that's also across the wider sector and globally. So we've facilitated those conversations across these chief science advisors. They already meet as a set, but they don't necessarily meet with the sector. And the sector is who we meet with all the time. And that matchmaking led to what's called the Strategic Priority Fund, which actually was allowed those chief science advisors to put on paper what were their priorities, and then we could actually go to government and say we can put some money behind some fairly large, and I mean large, very large funding that would be very hard to do in a normal funding cycle. So we're talking 50 to 100 million pounds, massive sort of programs. But the other thing is to really think, how do we actually badge up this brilliant work that people are doing? So on a slightly smaller scale, we funded what we're calling policy and evidence centers. And these are places that have taken large-scale, grand problematics. And actually, that's all that they are dedicated to doing, is bringing together the brilliant research that people are doing and actually trying to document that evidence, especially in places where that evidence doesn't exist well or is hard to translate and understand, but making that available to everyone, not just government, but to all sorts of people. And these PECs, as we call them, have been hugely influential around modern slavery or other sets of things to really transform how, and these are research led, by the way. They're not led by policymakers, but they are working hand in hand in those policy and evidence centers. So that was just to give you two examples that we can create a multiple model in terms of moving forward, as opposed to it one way or the other.
Thank you very much. Would anybody like to comment on those points? I think they were pretty clear. Yeah, Juliette?
I don't want to be polemic.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's nice to have a bit of discussion, so go ahead.
As a matter of fact, I think it's important also maybe, you're talking about national money when it comes to fund research. There's also a lot of private money, and it's also important that researchers raise some aspect, and the type of study you're doing right now is raising them. Just one statistic that we all know when we work in Femtech. Today, in the world, research on women's health, all disease, women's health, represent 2% of the, 4% of the total of all research. No, sorry, let me put it right. 2% of all health research. Prostate cancer, so that's one disease, represent 4%. So 4% versus 2% for all women's disease. And this is because most of the choices made today in terms of research are funded by a little bit of public money that is raising, let's say, that is working as a level, and then it's paid by private money. So it's also important that some of small-scale projects may be funded and raise their voices, or we won't have all the type of research we need. And what you're doing right now is important regarding that.
Yeah, if I may make, go ahead. Yeah, if I may make a point on this, actually, I was reading something very recently, and God knows I'm no specialist of the issue, but indeed it seems that all pharma research is done on men, and the experiments on mice are done on male mice. And but it's true, because female mice have babies and so on, and it's annoying. You can't wait until they're so it really stretches very far, including in pharma research and so on. What you were talking about.
That's right. I mean, things are getting better, but most of the cohort that have been where medicine are being tested for a lot of reasons, including the fact that there has been a law that was passed in '77 regarding the risk of having a pregnant woman being included in a clinical test. Most of the clinical tests are done on men, which tend, and I think I was discussing this with one of you today, which tends to have some medicines that are not. That don't have the right doses for women.
Mm-hmm. No, you're fine.
Emer, please.
It was just, I suppose, it was just bringing back to Brigitte's point about this chicken and egg, about which comes first. Is it the policy or is it the research? And I think that. I mean, certainly I'm looking at the Irish context, and I think at the moment we're very fortunate that we have a Department of Higher Education and a minister who's leading the charge on a lot of issues around gender-based violence and EDI in general. And I think that change, that political will and change that you're talking about, Anna-Liisa, I think that comes in cycles, and I think it's really significant and important that at the time that cycle came around, where gender-based violence and EDI was becoming an issue of note, that we already had that research coming through. There was already really great stuff happening in the country. There was people working on the bystander intervention that Mariana was talking about earlier, and there was active consent happening in NUI Galway. And a lot of research went into those projects, and the fact that they were already there meant that snowballing effect of ramping up and being able to fall in behind these, and everybody putting their hand up and saying, oh, we have information on this. And when it came to the point of putting together an advisory board, there was some really great evidence base there to draw upon. There was active collaborations between universities who were working on these in this space. So I think it's probably a balance of having both. You need the research to be ongoing, and I suppose this is probably something Karen will speak to as well in the UKRI, that there's always this ongoing debate about the fundamental researchers versus where you're applying that research. And I think that the important thing that we've always heard from the research community is that fundamental research, or that basis of your research, that needs to be there. And that's why we've been able to move forward so quickly in Ireland with a lot of work on gender-based violence, because the evidence was there, because the research was there. So in that chicken and egg scenario, I think it is a case of you need to be fortunate with the political will, but the research needs to exist in the first place. So.
Next question. Yes, please.
Just to give an example of a positive interaction between public organisms and researchers in Italy, we have the Italian Ministry of Health that has organized a table with researchers, representative from the major institute of research about implementation of gender medicine in Italy. That has a special law, and it was we are discussing about how are the methods, how this plan has to be implemented in the real situation of Italy. Also, we have the Istituto Superiore di Sanità that is inside the ministry, that has an observatory of, and they are promoting gender equality and inclusion. So this is a very positive example of this kind of interaction between policy makers and researchers.
Thank you. Yes. Right behind you, we have a question from the gentleman there.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. More like a question, a comment. And I think that we must realize that health policy is just politics applied to health. And I don't know how many of us, I haven't been trained of how to sell my research, sell my findings, interact with the stakeholders to actually push for our own agenda, which may be relevant to the decision makers and the stakeholders. I think that's something that perhaps we need. When I look at gender-based violence research, I mean, there has been, and the changes have been made all over the world. This is because researchers and activists have worked together to push for their own agenda, to make these issues relevant, and to take the windows of opportunities that may come, and to perhaps go beyond the idea that I produce fantastic studies with fantastic results and I give them to the policymakers and they will say, oh, lovely, this is what I was needing, fantastic, I'm going to make it into policy. I don't know if you are familiar with that. That has never happened to me. So how do we learn to lobby and to actually be active part of the decision-making process as researchers? Just a comment in general. Thank you.
Thank you. The art of lobbying. Well, you're in the second largest lobby capital in the world after Washington. So, I'm sure there's a few people in Brussels who could help with that. We have another point.
Yeah, it was just a remark to follow on, and I agree. Sometimes it's hard to, reach policymakers, or when they make them change their minds. But one thing that we found in our project is really working with civil society and NGOs is a really effective way as well, because they lobby all the time and they know how to lobby, but often they don't have research for their advocacy. So we work with loads of NGOs, and providing them with data for their advocacy, I think, is also a really useful way to have an influence on policy. So that was just something that I thought, people in bureaucracies or in Parliament aren't the only people that are influencing policy. It's also, a whole range of other actors who we can work with.
And companies as well, right? Juliette, yeah, exactly.
Well, actually, it's a very good point. We, as I was explaining, I'm here representing an NGO of entrepreneur, and our goal, let's be clear, is to make sure that that we are not forgotten in the funds that are allocated in France and since we are working in France, allocated in France to innovation in health, and they are huge these days for a lot of reasons. So we and we tend we want, as a matter of fact, I have a clear example of that. The one of the issue with having so few research on women's health is that there are few data on women's health, on women's pathologies and disease, and we wanted to, and as you know today, if you want some money in health today, you have to work in AI. So imaging and in AI is images. Sorry, in AI it's or biotech. That's a good a good lottery. And actually that would be great. But today we don't have any images for one of the reasons being that most of the women's disease are diseases that are being healed in town and not in the hospital. So we need to gather that type of data. So what we are building right now is we have approached some researchers, some scientists, so that we could have their input on the type of data they need, how they are gathering that type of data, which country is today in Europe maybe a leader in that type of data on women's disease, and together we are doing a plaidoyer, so that we a plea, thanks, a plea, so that we can bring that to the French government and explain what we could do together with their help, and it can be money, it can also be laws, it can be politics, but so that we can work together. I mean, I'm not saying that the private sector is always friendly, but it can also be a support for a research team to build together a corresponding, to go together for similar goals.
Thank you very much. I think we're reaching the end of our discussion. I'm just turning to all three of you. Would one of you like to make maybe a comment or a plea for a next step, or just a couple of concluding words on the overall discussion or this particular debate?
More of this, please. That's great.
I think that sums up definitely the general impression, whether from the research side or the funding organization side, which is a very good sign, I'm sure. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. To those of you following us online, I hope you had the stamina to stay with us until now, because you didn't regret it, I'm sure, if you did. So we'll now invite you to move on to well-deserved drinks and a bite to eat, and we'll resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Have a very nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.